At this point, we have all the basic tools to complete our model of the economy to account for everybody that we would need to account for in terms of a particular economy, a particular country. So far, we've accounted for the public sector, that's the governments. We've accounted for the private sector, that's the individual households and businesses in that economy. The only people we haven't accounted for yet is everybody outside of the economy, the foreign sector. So in this video, we're going to integrate the foreign sector into our model. So with just a private and public sector, we could say aggregate demand is equal to consumption plus intended investments plus government spending. We could look at that in terms of our flow model. Here's your consumption, here's your intended investments, here's your government spending. Savings and taxes is just money that doesn't become parts of the consumption component of spending. So we want to integrate in that third parts of the model, the foreign sector, and we're going to do this through imports and exports. Imports are going to act as our foreign sector leakage. Imports are when people in our economy are buying real goods and services from people in other countries, other economies, which means spending is leaking out of the domestic economy. Imports means that the money isn't becoming part of the spending on the stuff our economy produced. Exports are the reverse. They're an injection. That's money being spent into our economy coming from abroad. And it's easy to get these confused because we're used to thinking of imports and exports in terms of the actual goods and services. But for our purposes here, we're not concerned with those as much as we are the actual money, the spending. So we think of imports as stuff coming into the economy. But for our purposes, it's more important to think of that as the money leaving the economy to buy that stuff that's coming in. Likewise, in reverse for exports, we think of exports as stuff leaving our economy. But for our model, it's better to think of that as spending coming into the economy to pay for that stuff that's being exported. Once we've got the foreign sector, then we've completed the equation. We've now got aggregate demand is equal to consumption spending plus intended investments plus government spending plus net exports. That's exports minus the leakage of the imports. We can do the accounting in terms of surpluses and deficits here as well. And note again, it's easy to get these reversed. Usually when we're talking about foreign trade, we would talk about a trade surplus. That's when our exports are greater than our imports. But in terms of the actual spending flows, a trade surplus is actually a net injection of spending into the economy. So I want you to think in terms of a trade deficit, exports exceeding imports as being the rest of the world, the foreign sector, running a deficit in the spending sense. That is, they're spending more into our economy than they're taking out. The same thing goes for trade deficits, but in reverse. Trade deficits occur when exports are less than imports, which for our purposes is a net withdrawal of spending from the economy. That is, the rest of the world is running a surplus in the sense that they're taking more dollars out of the economy than they're spending back into it. We can also then think in the accounting terms of leakages being equal to injections. When we were dealing just with the private and the public sectors, leakages equal to injections meant savings plus taxes had to come out equal to investments plus government spending. We can add then the foreign sector by just adding imports on the leakage side and exports on the injection side. And again, this has to come out equal. Injections and leakages have to come out equal in the aggregates. In fact, this is true in the accounting when we're talking about accounting for gross domestic product and that sort of thing. This has to also be true if we include as part of that investment component those unplanned inventory investments. Once we include all investments, including the unplanned ones, it has to be the case by accounting identity that savings plus taxes plus imports have to come out equal to investment plus government spending plus exports for any given country. And if that's the case, then what we said about surpluses and deficits also must be the case. Suppose we rearrange this equation of leakages equal to injections so that we had the private and foreign sectors on one side and the public sector, the governments, on the other side. Here we've got S minus I sub I, savings minus intended investment, and that's your private sector. If that number is positive, we say the private sector is in surplus. If that number is negative, we say the private sector is in deficits. The next term then is your foreign sector. If that number is positive, we say the foreign sector is in a surplus. Again, we'd usually call that a trade deficit, but I want you to think of that as a foreign sector surplus. If that number comes out negative, we say the foreign sector is in deficits. On the right-hand side, then, you've got government spending minus taxes. That's your public sector. If that number comes out positive, we say the public sector, the government, is in a deficit. If that number comes out negative, we would say the public sector is in a surplus. So just hypothetically, let's suppose that we've got an economy in which the domestic private sector wishes to net save financial assets. We would usually say the private sector is trying to accumulate wealth there. It's trying to save more financial assets than the liabilities that get created through investment, which is just another way of saying that savings exceeds intended investment. Let's say also that this country is running a trade deficit, which again I want you to think of as a foreign sector surplus, imports exceeding exports. If these two things are true, the private sector is running a surplus and the foreign sector is running a surplus, then what must be true of the government's budget? We can answer this by just looking at the equation. If the private sector is running a surplus, that's telling us savings is greater than intended investment. So savings minus intended investment comes out to greater than zero. So that term there is positive. Likewise, if the country is running a trade deficit, that's the foreign sector surplus. Imports minus exports comes out to greater than zero. So that's telling us that that term there is positive. So it doesn't take a math genius to know that if this term is a positive number, and this term is a positive number, then this term must also come out to a positive number, specifically a positive number great enough to offset to be equal to the other two positive numbers. Notice then what that's telling us is that if the private sector is running a surplus and the foreign sector is running a surplus, then the public sector must be running a deficit that is large enough to come out equal to the sum of the other two sectors' surpluses. And again, this is simply true by accounting identity, at least when we include all investments. And this is true for the same reasons that we've seen in the past. Surpluses and deficits are by definition two sides of the same coin. If one sector is running a surplus, that means it's taking in more money. It's receiving more dollars than it's spending. And for that to be the case, some other sector has to be doing the opposite. It has to be running a deficit. It has to be spending more dollars than it's receiving. And we see this in the national income and product accounts. Here's the actual data for the United States quarter by quarter going back to the early 1960s. Now, I want you to have a good understanding of what this sectoral balances graph is telling us, because you're going to see it over and over again throughout this term. You've got a zero line here in the middle, and what that's telling us is for any sector that is at that zero line, that sector's budget, if you will, is balanced. Its leakages are equal to its injections. If the sector is above that zero line, then we would say that sector is in surplus. So, for instance, if we look at the mid-1960s, the blue line representing the private sector, the U.S. households and businesses, was in a surplus of just a little under 5%, and these are in terms of GDP, so just a little less than 5% of GDP was the private sector surplus. The green bars then represents the foreign sector, and the red bars represent the government, the public sector. And the last thing to know about this graph is these bars are stacking, so it's not overlapping. So for instance, if you go here to, let's say, around 1987, you can see that the foreign sector was running a surplus, what we would normally call a trade deficit, of about 3% of GDP, and the private sector was running a surplus of about another 2% of GDP. So those two sectors combined were running surpluses of about 5% of GDP. Go to that same time period and look below the zero line, and what you're going to see is that the public sector, the federal government, is running a deficit of, again, the same amount, about 5% of GDP. So what most people recognize immediately when they look at this graph is it is a mirror image around that zero line, hence the imagery that I've been using in these videos. And the reason for that, again, is because being above the zero line means sectors in surplus, and being below the zero line means sectors in deficit. And it has to, again, be the case that sectors in surplus are offset exactly by other sectors in deficits. This is why you get that mirror image effect in this graph. So I really want to emphasize this point, that surpluses must come out equal to deficits once we've accounted for all three sectors, because that's going to be very important later on in the term. And I think you'll find that it tells us some very interesting stories that might be counterintuitive when we think about deficits and surpluses, especially when it comes to the governments. But we'll see that in another lecture.